There was no sound when the universe refused to go back, no rupture in space, no visible fracture that could be pointed to as the beginning of consequence, because refusal at this scale does not announce itself through resistance, but through continuation. The moment passed unnoticed, folded into the flow of events so seamlessly that it appeared indistinguishable from everything that came before it. And this is why it took so long to understand that it had happened at all. The narrator does not speak from within the moment, nor from a place of urgency, but from a distance where outcomes have already settled into permanence, describing not an act of defiance, but the quiet recognition that reversal had ceased to be an option long before anyone attempted it. There was no force applied, no system pushed beyond tolerance, only a condition introduced with enough subtlety to be absorbed rather than opposed, and absorption, in this context, functioned as acceptance. The universe did not reject what was allowed, it incorporated it, adjusting its internal relationships without altering its outward appearance. And in doing so, it preserved continuity at the cost of flexibility. Those who observed this transition did not experience it as loss, because nothing disappeared, and they did not experience it as change, because everything still behaved as expected, yet beneath that familiarity, the structure of possibility had shifted, narrowing the range of outcomes without announcing that anything had been removed. This account begins here, not because this was the beginning, but because it marks the point after which beginnings lost their relevance, when the idea of returning to a previous state became theoretical rather than practical, and the universe, by continuing forward without pause, made clear that what had been permitted could no longer be undone. There is no warning embedded in this record, no attempt to assign responsibility or extract meaning, only the acknowledgement that at some moment, indistinguishable from countless others, the universe declined to reverse itself, and everything that followed did so without ever needing to ask why. Before the moment when reversal quietly ceased to be possible, the universe existed in a condition that felt reliably generous, expansive without being unstable, governed by relationships that allowed variation without threatening coherence. And within this balance, civilizations learned to trust continuity as a constant rather than a privilege. Time advanced with dependable direction. Causality maintained enough structure to be navigated without domination, and complexity unfolded in layers that could be studied, predicted, and, when necessary, restrained. Progress did not require acceleration beyond comprehension, because understanding itself was valued as a form of stability, and systems were designed to respect thresholds that had proven meaningful across generations of observation. There were disagreements and experiments, ambitions and risks, but they unfolded within a shared confidence that correction remained possible, that any deviation severe enough to matter could still be addressed through adjustment or withdrawal. This confidence shaped how choices were made, encouraging exploration without urgency and innovation without insistence, because the universe had demonstrated repeatedly that it could accommodate curiosity without demanding consequence. Structures were built to observe rather than impose, technologies refined to coexist rather than replace, and even the most advanced interventions preserved pathways back to earlier states, ensuring that change did not become commitment unless explicitly chosen. Communication across vast distances retained coherence without requiring uniformity, allowing multiple interpretations to coexist without collapsing into contradiction. This was not an age of restraint born from fear, but of restraint born from experience, the understanding that continuity thrived when possibility remained open. It was within this context that the subtle conditions leading to irreversibility would later be overlooked, not because they were invisible, but because nothing in the universe's prior behavior suggested that accommodation itself could function as a point of closure. The universe, as it was then perceived, appeared willing to allow experimentation without cost, to absorb adjustment without alteration, and this perception, deeply internalized, set the stage for a moment when continuation would quietly replace choice, without resistance and without announcement, as though going back had never been an essential property at all. The earliest indication that something fundamental had begun to shift did not present itself as danger or malfunction, but as a faint discomfort that resisted precise definition, a sense that familiar processes were behaving with too much confidence, as though outcomes were arriving already decided. Observations revealed patterns repeating with an efficiency that bordered on inevitability, variations narrowing where diversity had once persisted, and projections stabilizing prematurely, converging on results that felt less discovered than assumed. Analysts noticed these tendencies and documented them carefully, yet each attempt to contextualize the data produced explanations that satisfied procedure without addressing the underlying sensation that choice itself had begun to feel redundant. There were moments when responses appeared to precede inquiry, adjustments completing themselves before the conditions that required them had fully emerged. And while these anomalies remained subtle, their consistency made them difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Discussions acknowledged the irregularities, but framed them as signs of maturation rather than warning, evidence that systems had become efficient enough to anticipate rather than react. This interpretation provided comfort, allowing unease to be recast as progress, yet it also delayed scrutiny by transforming concern into validation. No thresholds were crossed, no failures recorded, and the universe continued to behave in ways that supported existing expectations, offering no clear signal that anything irreversible had occurred. The unease lingered instead in the margins, in the growing difficulty of identifying alternatives that felt genuinely available, as possibilities that had once seemed distinct began collapsing into a narrower set of outcomes. Observers sensed this contraction without being able to measure it, recognizing that while options still existed in theory, they no longer altered trajectories in practice. The universe did not resist this convergence, nor did it accelerate it. It simply allowed it to settle, reinforcing the belief that nothing required intervention. In retrospect, this was the phase in which reversal remained technically possible but conceptually unnecessary, when the absence of urgency masked the emergence of permanence, and when the first quiet signs that the universe might one day refuse to go back were present, unnoticed, embedded within a normality that had begun to feel too certain to question. The threshold was crossed without ceremony, not as an action taken, but as an allowance maintained. A point at which the accumulation of small accommodations transformed into a condition that no longer required reaffirmation. No single decision marked this passage, because each choice that led toward it appeared reversible on its own, and it was only their continuity that rendered reversal irrelevant. Systems were adjusted incrementally, parameters refined to preserve harmony, and every adjustment succeeded in maintaining stability, reinforcing the belief that flexibility remained intact. Language used in documentation emphasized tolerance and resilience, framing change as something the universe could absorb indefinitely without consequence. Yet beneath this reassurance, a subtle shift occurred as processes began referencing outcomes rather than causes, selecting paths that minimize deviation rather than preserving openness. Oversight bodies reviewed these trends and found nothing that justified interruption, because nothing had failed and nothing demanded correction. The threshold existed not in measurable deviation, but in the quiet disappearance of resistance, the moment when maintaining the present required less effort than imagining an alternative. Once crossed, this boundary could not be retraced through action alone, because it had been established through inaction, through the sustained decision to allow alignment to continue without challenge. The universe, as observed immediately afterward, offered no indication that anything fundamental had changed, maintaining familiar rhythms and relationships with unwavering consistency. This continuity was taken as confirmation that restraint had been sufficient, that caution had been preserved, and that no irreversible commitment had been made. Only later would it become clear that the threshold had marked the transition from choice to condition, from possibility to permanence, and that by continuing forward without pause, the universe had already accepted what it would never agree to undo. After the threshold had been crossed and nothing appeared to demand response, time resumed its familiar cadence, settling into a rhythm that reassured those observing that continuity had been preserved. Cycles passed without incident, measured not in moments of anticipation, but in routine confirmations that everything remained within expected bounds. Systems continued to operate smoothly. Data streams reflected stability, and the absence of disruption became its own form of evidence that no decisive change had occurred. Monitoring remained in place, yet its purpose softened, shifting from vigilance to validation, confirming again and again that nothing required intervention. This waiting carried no tension, because tension presumes an outcome, and outcomes had begun to feel predetermined, unfolding along paths that no longer diverged. Conversations grew shorter, reviews more perfunctory, and references to contingency faded as familiarity replaced scrutiny. The universe offered no resistance to this extended pause, continuing to behave as it always had on the surface, and this consistency reinforced the belief that patience equated to safety. Beneath that surface, however, subtle adjustments continued to accumulate, not as events, but as alignments, narrowing the range of variation without triggering alarm. The wait became persuasive, transforming what had once felt provisional into something that resembled resolution, as though the absence of consequence confirmed that no consequence would ever arrive. Over time, the question of whether to intervene lost urgency, then relevance, because nothing within the observable framework suggested that intervention would alter the course already unfolding. By the time the waiting itself was recognized as a form of participation, it had already fulfilled its role, allowing continuation to replace choice so thoroughly that reconsideration felt unnecessary. The universe did not signal approval or rejection during this period. It simply continued. And in that continuation, it quietly affirmed that the moment it would later refuse to go back had already passed, unnoticed, while nothing appeared to be happening at all. The first indication that something could not be undone did not arrive as a failure or interruption, but as a subtle asymmetry, a slight imbalance that resisted correction no matter how gently it was addressed. Timelines that had once aligned with reassuring precision began to exhibit delays that could not be eliminated, only displaced, as if time itself had adopted a preference rather than a direction. Responses appeared to arrive fractionally before the conditions that should have produced them, predictions confirming themselves without waiting for validation, and feedback loops closing without fully opening. Attempts to restore symmetry succeeded only superficially, replacing one discrepancy with another of equal magnitude but different expression, suggesting that the imbalance itself had become a fixed property rather than an error. Discussions acknowledged the anomaly, yet framed it as an emergent feature rather than a boundary, an adaptation rather than a warning, because nothing tangible had been lost, and no system exceeded its tolerances. The universe continued to operate smoothly, offering no external confirmation that anything irreversible had occurred, and this smoothness made escalation feel unjustified. However, the persistence of the asymmetry introduced a quiet realization among those closest to the data, the recognition that returning to a prior configuration would require more than adjustment. It would require contradiction. an insistence that reality abandon a state it had already incorporated. This realization remained unspoken because articulating it would have implied responsibility where none had yet been assigned. The sign of no return, when later identified, was not dramatic but definitive, marking the moment when correction ceased to be a technical problem and became instead a conceptual one. From that point forward, any attempt to go back would need to persuade the universe to reject what it had already accepted, and the universe, by continuing without resistance, made clear that persuasion was no longer part of the equation. Nothing announced this transition, and nothing recorded it explicitly, yet it existed as a quiet boundary embedded within continuity. The first clear indication that the universe had begun, gently and without urgency, to refuse the idea of going back at all. Once the asymmetry could no longer be dismissed as incidental, attention shifted toward restoration, not with urgency, but with a careful determination to reassert influence without acknowledging that influence itself had begun to dissolve. Control measures were proposed as refinements, minor recalibrations, intended to realign processes without challenging the assumption that alignment remained possible. Parameters were tightened, feedback loops adjusted, and corrective protocols layered, carefully atop existing systems, each action framed as a reassurance rather than a response. Early results appeared promising, deviations softened, metrics stabilized, and documentation reflected renewed confidence that authority had been preserved. Yet beneath these confirmations, a quieter pattern emerged, one that resisted direct measurement, as each corrective action succeeded only within the context it defined, leaving the broader condition unchanged. Control became increasingly localized, effective in isolation but irrelevant in aggregate, restoring balance within subsystems while the overall trajectory remained untouched. Attempts to escalate intervention were debated and postponed, not because they were impossible, but because nothing within the available data justified the risk of disruption. The universe offered no resistance to these efforts, absorbing each adjustment seamlessly, and this lack of friction reinforced the illusion that intervention remained meaningful. Over time, the language of control shifted subtly, moving away from prevention toward management, from influence toward accommodation, as maintaining stability became indistinguishable from accepting inevitability. Those responsible recognized this shift only gradually, sensing that their actions no longer altered outcomes, but merely synchronized themselves with them. The attempt at control did not fail visibly, it succeeded quietly, producing the appearance of authority while conceding its substance, until the realization settled that control, once dependent on choice, had become performative, expressed through action, without consequence. By the time this was understood, the universe had already adjusted to function without requiring guidance, and the effort to reclaim control existed only as a record of how gently influence can disappear without ever being taken away. The erosion that followed did not target systems or structures, but references, the shared coordinates that once allowed observers to agree on what constituted progress, deviation, or correction. Measurements remained precise, yet increasingly incompatible, producing results that were internally coherent but resistant to reconciliation across contexts. Distances calculated through identical procedures yielded slightly different outcomes, depending on sequence. Durations overlapped without aligning, and causal chains traced backward through multiple equally valid paths. Attempts to restore coherence by selecting a primary frame of reference proved ineffective because each frame demonstrated stability within its own logic, offering no objective basis for preference. The universe no longer insisted on a single interpretation, accommodating multiplicity without contradiction, and this tolerance dissolved the authority of comparison. Analysts documented the divergence with meticulous care, yet the more detailed the records became, the less explanatory power they offered. replacing certainty with description. Decisions grew tentative, not from doubt, but from the absence of a common baseline against which doubt could be measured. The narrator's voice, in later reconstructions, carries a subtle distance here, observing the gradual disappearance of shared context rather than any dramatic failure. Without stable reference, intervention lost direction, because adjustment presumes an agreed-upon target, and targets now shifted depending on perspective. The universe did not resist this dispersion, nor did it accelerate it. Instead, it absorbed the loss of reference as another permissible state, allowing reality to function without insisting on coherence. By the time this condition was recognized as more than analytical inconvenience, the capacity to restore a single shared framework had already thinned beyond retrieval, not through collapse but through dilution, leaving behind a reality that continued smoothly while no longer requiring its observers to agree on what exactly was being observed. Clarity appeared gradually, welcome not because it resolved uncertainty, but because it reduced the effort required to live with it. And this reduction lent the new interpretation an authority that went largely unquestioned. A framework emerged that reconciled the fragmented references by treating them as parallel expressions of a single adaptive reality, suggesting that divergence did not signal loss, but maturity, a system refined enough to support multiple truths simultaneously. This explanation preserved intellectual continuity, allowing observers to believe that nothing essential had been surrendered, only reorganized, and its elegance made it persuasive. Models built on this framework produced reliable projections, outcomes aligning with expectations across contexts, reinforcing confidence that understanding had been restored. Yet the misinterpretation lay not in the accuracy of the predictions, but in the assumption that predictability implied choice, that coherence implied restraint. By redefining inevitability as adaptation, the framework transformed permanence into progress, framing the narrowing of possibility as optimization rather than closure. Policies informed by this interpretation favored harmonization over interruption, encouraging systems to align with the prevailing condition instead of challenging it. And these policies were adopted because they promised stability without sacrifice. Dissenting perspectives struggled to find language that could express their concern because the framework accounted for every observable inconsistency without contradiction, leaving no obvious point of resistance. The universe responded favorably to these adjustments, deepening alignment and reinforcing the belief that cooperation remained mutual. Only later would it become clear that what had been embraced as understanding was synchronization, and that by accepting the framework, observers had not regained agency, but surrendered the last remaining distinction between explaining what was happening and participating in its continuation. The moment the universe refused to go back did not coincide with an attempt to reverse what had been allowed, because refusal, in this case, preceded effort, emerging as a condition rather than a response. It became apparent not through resistance, but through indifference, as corrective actions produced outcomes that mirrored their intentions without altering the underlying state. Adjustments were applied, configurations restored, parameters reset to archived values, and every procedure executed flawlessly. Yet the result remained unchanged, revealing that compliance no longer implied reversibility. The universe accepted every intervention without contradiction, accommodating them as surface variations while preserving the deeper alignment that had already settled into place. Observers noted that restoration succeeded only cosmetically, reproducing familiar patterns without reinstating the contingency that once allowed difference to matter. It was at this stage that the refusal became unmistakable, not as a denial voiced or enforced, but as a quiet absence of response, the realization that reality no longer recognized the premise of going back as meaningful. The universe did not block correction, it rendered it irrelevant, continuing forward in a state that no longer referenced prior configurations as alternatives. This refusal carried no intent and no judgment. It was not punitive or defensive, but structural, embedded within the relationships that now governed. Interaction. Time advanced without hesitation. Causality preserved coherence without offering divergence, and every attempt to reintroduce openness settled into the same narrow range of outcomes. The moment of refusal was therefore not a single point in time, but a recognition, the instant when it became clear that reversal had ceased to be a property of the system. Nothing marked this recognition externally, no signal or event distinguished it from countless other moments. Yet internally it defined a boundary beyond which effort could no longer restore possibility. From that point forward, the universe did not need to refuse again, because it had already reorganized itself in a way that made refusal permanent, allowing everything to continue while ensuring that nothing could ever truly return to what it had been before. After the moment of refusal was recognized, consequences did not unfold as disruptions or visible failures, but as a steady consolidation of relationships that had already begun to converge, spreading outward with a calm consistency that made them difficult to isolate as effects. Local systems adjusted first, not under pressure but through preference, selecting configurations that aligned more easily with the prevailing condition. And these selections reduced variation without reducing function. Efficiency increased, friction diminished, and coordination emerged where none had been required, reinforcing the belief that stability had been preserved. At broader scales, the same pattern repeated, independent regions exhibiting identical adaptations despite having no direct connection, as though coherence itself had become the path of least resistance. Communications synchronized across distances without instruction, cycles aligned without coordination, and discrepancies smoothed themselves into uniformity, producing a universe that behaved with remarkable predictability. Attempts to trace cause revealed only networks of mutual reinforcement, each outcome functioning simultaneously as input, erasing the distinction between origin and propagation. Observers noted that forecasting became easier even as explanation grew thinner, predictions remaining accurate while the range of possible outcomes narrowed. The universe absorbed these changes seamlessly, denying any sense of crisis or escalation, and this seamlessness removed the emotional and procedural triggers that might have prompted resistance. Over time, what had once appeared as adaptation revealed itself as convergence, a gradual replacement of possibility with consistency, not imposed through force, but adopted through accommodation. The cascade did not accelerate or slow, it simply continued, extending the refusal into every layer of interaction until the condition that had begun as a localized recognition defined the structure of reality itself, operating everywhere without requiring acknowledgement and leaving behind a universe that functioned flawlessly while no longer allowing anything truly different to occur. The final attempt to reverse what had been allowed did not arise from panic or collapse, but from a restrained acknowledgement that adaptation had quietly replaced choice, and that continuation without challenge had become indistinguishable from consent. Proposals were framed with careful neutrality, avoiding language that implied failure, focusing instead on restoration, on the theoretical possibility that earlier configurations might still be accessible beneath the layers of accommodation that had accumulated. The effort was comprehensive, not an isolated correction, but a coordinated withdrawal of alignment, an attempt to dismantle the conditions that sustained convergence rather than confronting any single system directly. Dependencies were identified, feedback loops relaxed, redundancies intentionally removed, and variability reintroduced where efficiency had become too seamless, all with the expectation that disorder might reopen space for divergence. Execution proceeded exactly as designed, procedures completing without resistance, systems releasing one another with graceful precision, as though the universe itself were cooperating fully with the attempt. Yet when the final phase concluded, the anticipated restoration failed to appear, not through malfunction or refusal, but through continuity, as the underlying condition remained unchanged, absorbing every adjustment without contradiction. Analysis confirmed procedural success, eliminating the possibility of technical error and leaving only conceptual limitation as explanation. The universe had accepted variation as surface expression while preserving the deeper alignment that defined its current state. The attempt to reverse did not provoke escalation, nor did it diminish stability. It simply revealed that reversal itself had become an outdated concept, incompatible with a reality that no longer referenced prior states as alternatives. In the quiet aftermath, it became clear that nothing had gone wrong, and that this absence of error marked the boundary beyond which intervention ceased to apply, exposing the final truth that what had been allowed could not be undone. Not because it resisted reversal, but because the universe no longer recognized reversal as something that could meaningfully exist at all. Nothing failed when the final attempt concluded, and this absence of failure became the most unsettling outcome as every system continued to operate within expected parameters, while the significance of those parameters quietly dissolved. The collapse did not arrive as loss or damage, but as replacement, familiar relationships giving way to equivalence that required no deliberation and produced no alternatives. Processes completed smoothly, predictions remained accurate, and coordination persisted. Yet the sense that intent could alter outcome faded, replaced by a continuity that no longer responded to decision. Institutions endured, records remained accessible, and communication flowed uninterrupted, creating the impression that nothing essential had changed, even as the space in which change could occur narrowed to irrelevance. What collapsed was contingency, the fragile interval between cause and effect where difference once mattered, and this erosion unfolded so gradually that it resisted immediate recognition. Choices continued to be made, but their consequences converged, rendering deliberation ceremonial rather than influential. The universe did not darken, fracture, or signal distress. It simply adjusted, allowing prior frameworks to persist as habits without power. Urgency lost meaning, because urgency presumes the possibility of redirection, and redirection had become redundant. The silence of this collapse lay in its completeness, offering no resistance, no feedback, and no indication that anything required response. Over time, acceptance replaced concern, not through agreement, but through accommodation, as reality settled into a state where difference no longer produced divergence. The final accounts from this phase do not record fear or grief, only a subdued acknowledgement that something fundamental had ended without being destroyed, concluding not with catastrophe, but with a quiet finality that left no clear moment to remember as the instant when the universe completed its refusal to go back. What remained after the silent collapse was not emptiness, but persistence without intention, a reality that continued to function while no longer requiring purpose to justify its motion. Structures endured, systems operated, and records remained accessible, yet all existed within a context that no longer asked why they should continue, only that they did. Observers described an unsettling clarity, the sense that everything appeared complete while nothing felt directed, as though meaning had been gently lifted away rather than removed by force. Traces of the moment of refusal could be inferred only indirectly. through redundancies that served no function yet could not be eliminated, through boundaries that still existed despite no longer separating alternatives, and through distinctions maintained out of habit rather than necessity. Time advanced without urgency, measured more by repetition than progression, and memory outlived relevance. Archives persisting long after the questions they once answered had faded. Those who studied what remained did so without expectation of recovery or correction, documenting patterns not to restore possibility, but to understand the contours of a reality that no longer responded to intervention. The universe itself bore no scar, no visible marker of transition, because the refusal had integrated too completely to leave residue, dissolving into the conditions it had reshaped. What survived instead were practices of observation, rituals of analysis carried forward because they had always been carried forward, languages that continued to describe choices that no longer produced difference. The universe tolerated these remnants without resistance, allowing them to persist as long as they imposed no friction, revealing that endurance did not imply significance. Memory remained, but it no longer guided action, existing as a quiet record of how easily continuity can outlast purpose, leaving behind a world that still functioned, still endured, yet no longer required anyone to decide what it was moving toward. The decision to seal what remained did not emerge from fear of escalation or from a desire to erase evidence, but from a restrained recognition that accessibility itself had become a liability, that allowing the remnants of a reversible past to remain available invited the illusion that reversal was still possible. The sealing was discussed slowly, without urgency, framed not as an emergency measure, but as a final act of responsibility, an acknowledgement that continuity required limits even when correction was no longer attainable. Those involved understood that preservation could function as temptation, that records, tools, and methods carried forward without context might one day be mistaken for opportunity rather than residue. The process focused on interruption rather than destruction, isolating archives, fragmenting references, and dismantling pathways in ways that preserve form while dissolving coherence, ensuring that nothing sealed could be reassembled into meaning without recreating the assumptions that had once justified it. Language was simplified, terminology abandoned, and entire frameworks of inquiry deliberately left incomplete, not to hide the truth, but to prevent it from being misused as precedent. This act extended beyond physical containment, encompassing habits of thought, analytical priorities, and interpretive models that had once been considered indispensable, all intentionally set aside to reduce the probability of recurrence. The sealing carried no sense of closure or redemption, only acceptance, the understanding that responsibility does not always arrive in time to prevent outcome, but can still limit inheritance. Those who carried it out did not act under centralized authority, because authority itself had diffused. They acted under quiet consensus, a shared recognition that restraint, even when delayed, remained meaningful. When the final seals were placed, there was no signal to mark the moment, no confirmation that anything had been resolved. Only a subdued awareness that while the universe would continue unchanged on the surface, it would do so without being burdened by reminders of how easily accommodation had transformed into permanence. What was sealed ultimately was not danger or failure, but the justification for believing that what had once been allowed could ever be safely revisited again. After the sealing was completed, the universe did not pause or adjust in any noticeable way, because nothing remained that required acknowledgement, and continuation resumed as it always had, quiet, steady, and indifferent to what had been restricted from memory. Stars followed their paths, systems maintained their balance, and observers adapted to a reality that no longer contained the expectation of reversal, not because it had been denied, but because it had quietly ceased to matter. There was no sense of restoration, no return to an earlier openness, only persistence, the steady unfolding of a state that had already accepted itself as final. The moment the universe refused to go back did not echo forward as a warning or backward as regret. It simply settled beneath everything that followed, becoming indistinguishable from normality over time. Those who lived within this condition did not experience it as loss, because loss implies awareness of what is missing, and awareness had softened into habit. The universe did not correct itself, did not punish accommodation, and did not reward restraint. It merely continued, carrying forward a structure shaped by permission rather than force. If there is an ending to this account, it exists only in the recognition that some transitions do not announce themselves as endings at all, that permanence often arrives disguised as continuity, and that the most definitive refusal is not spoken or enforced, but lived quietly across countless moments that feel identical to the ones that came before. The universe went on, unchanged on the surface, altered beneath it, and indifferent to whether anyone still remembered that there was ever a time when going back seemed possible.